Hi, this is Jacob with the Daniel 3 podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm excited to have Carrie Baldwin with us. Carrie is someone that um, I've followed for a while. I actually remember the first time I uh, saw you was with your debate.
Mhm.
That was with Reason, right? Um,
Yeah, the Soho Forum.
yeah.
Yep.
So, for those who don't know you, though, go ahead and introduce yourself and your background and what it is you do.
Sure. So my name is Carrie Baldwin. I have a website called mereliberty.com. Basically, I'm an independent researcher. I've got a degree in philosophy. And my website is focused on challenging paradigms in politics, religion, and culture. And so Um, basically, I talk about a variety of subjects from both a libertarian perspective and a reformed theological perspective. And sometimes those cross paths. And so I'll talk about that as well. I'm also a contributor at the Libertarian Christian Institute. And we just got done, or just got published, a book that I helped co author called Faith Seeking Freedom. Um, and yeah, that's basically who I am in a nutshell.
Yeah, I unfortunately I have the book and I was going to show it on the video, but I left it upstairs. But in
Right
case,
here. I got one.
good. Yeah, it's a great book. Definitely check that out. I'm not quite done with it. I'm about three-quarters of the way, although I did jump around a little bit because I kind of, for someone who's I've studied this stuff for a while, so I did kind of skim through the beginning stuff. Then I went back to like the table of contents and was kind of skipping around a little bit because I was curious to some of the
Sure.
exact answers that you guys had. But it's a really good book. I really do
Thank you.
recommend it. What was how long were you guys working on that? Was that like a couple years, or how long did that take to put together?
Well, as I understand it, Norm and Doug, who also are co-authors on the book, had been planning to do it for a couple of years. So I'd say that, the planning stages probably took the longest, but as far as writing it, we actually got sort of notification from Doug and Norm that they wanted to write this book at the beginning of the year. So just before COVID hit, uh, we were invited to start writing it. So this became this became a lockdown project. We were working on it while everybody was on lockdown. So
Yeah, that's I guess it was convenient to be able to have something to do when we were told not to go out and live life anymore.
right, yeah.
Oh, God. So, yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about the book. Not to spoil too much of the content in there, but
Sure.
since you were a contributor, there were some topics in there that I was curious what your take on it was.
Mhm.
One of the things that I noticed in the book was that it tried to really draw a difference between like capital G, like government, and then like
Mhm.
the act of governing, like governing as a verb or action that we do.
Right.
Can you maybe explain that a little bit? Because I know for a lot of like libertarians and anarchists, when they're coming in, this is like really confusing
Mhm.
terminology sometimes. We talk about how bad government is all the time, but then in the book, it talks about how governing isn't inherently bad. So what's your take on that, and sort of the Christian and logical reasoning behind it?
Yeah, so the word government obviously is a noun, and we sort of use it synonymously with the state. So it's the entity that has monopolized civil governance. So civil governance is the act of administering civil justice. Or I like to call it a service, right? If we're talking about it in economic terms, you have goods and services. So the administration of civil justice is a service. Um, and that's what governance is. And so in the book, we really want to draw that distinction because what we aren't opposed to is the administration of civil justice. And we are opposed to the monopolization of it, I mean, that's the anarchist view. The minarchist view is um, of course, a very minimal state. There's a term called the night watchman state, for example, which basically is your constitutional republic. It's the idea that, you've got, um, these basic branches of government, some courts, some law enforcement, but that mostly they're supposed to stay out of your way. But we want to draw the distinction between those two things because we don't want to confuse the issue and try to say that civil governance is bad, or specifically that the administration of civil justice is bad, because Scripture tells us that God has ordained civil governance or the administration of civil justice, and so it would be wrong of us to deride that. But we do call into question how we go about doing that, which is what the book is all about.
Right. So, and it's a good way to put it. There's a lot of, and I talked about this with our friend Greg a little while back,
Hmm.
and yeah, there seems to be like a divide among libertarians and anarchists broadly, but also within the Christian libertarian world, those who think that there's like this no king but Christ, and Christian libertarianism is sort of a rejection of all authority, and that we just should, live our lives subjectively under God. And then um, I think LCI and us that are kind of more from, at least a lot of us from the Reformed school are more of the idea that, well, there's still a biblical role for authority and for governance, and we don't want to try to ignore those passages that are clearly in the Bible, whereas maybe other Christian libertarians find different ways of dealing with those passages or might avoid them altogether. What would civil governance be then? Just for those who aren't familiar with the term, you said it's like a service. So this is like just to lay that out. Is it just going after bad guys and contract disputing? Is there anything more to it that the Bible says that civil governance is for?
Well, yeah, I want to draw out another distinction that we often talk about, which is legitimate versus illegitimate authority. And I would say, you definitely have the libertarians who are somewhat jaded and have a disrespect for any kind of claimed authority. I would say that for both LCI and also the Reformed view, we hold authority, like legitimate authority, in very high regard. So we have a great respect for legitimate authority because it's ordained by God. And our respect for it is so great that we understand that it must necessarily be limited to its God ordained scope, because as soon as it goes outside of those bounds, it all gets delegitimized. And we see that by the fact that you have people who are jaded by even legitimate authority. So I would say we have a greater respect for authority than most people would like to give us credit for, and we're trying to protect that. Um, Now, as far as what biblical civil governance is, you know, Scripture talks a lot about um, a lot of the same uh, things that libertarians consider crimes, like theft and murder. And so the libertarian idea, or the libertarian principle of non-aggression, is actually a great way to express what we find in Scripture, which is that you cannot initiate violence against another person. So that, the initiation of violence against a person's life is murder. The initiation of violence against a person's property is theft. And we have two commandments, from God, that says don't murder and don't steal. So, um, and we also have other Bible verses which talk about, um, what that we can own property and we can do with that property what we wish. And there's also scripture that shows that we can't own other people, right? That slavery is wrong. So those are just a few examples, and of course we have biblical citations in the book. But that's essentially it. The role of civil government is to, as I said earlier, administer civil justice. So uh, um, that means adjudicating disputes between parties. That means seeking restitution when rights violations occur, and that sort of thing. So if there's a theft, then there needs to be restitution for that theft. If there's murder, there needs to be restitution for that murder. Um, so that's essentially it. It's very limited, I would say. That's the point.
Sure. One question that I don't recall seeing in the book, but if it's there, you can maybe point out where it was. Um, but I know like one question people often will have. I mean, you talked about there's two flavors: libertarianism. There's minarchism and anarchism. The minarchists would have this idea of the minimal state that doesn't go above what its God ordained jurisdiction is.
Mhm.
But if we had, would the Bible be able to support a anarchist view of civil governance where the market would be free to develop, market forces of governance that would enforce either uh, that wouldn't enforce the proper role of civil governance, whether it be going too far or not going far enough. And this kind of leads into like a question that people often have. I think when Christians first start to think about libertarianism is
Mhm.
abortion. Because that's a subject that is very a very hot button issue, very important to a lot of Christians of different backgrounds, and
Yeah.
it's like that sometimes is like the reason why a lot of Christians continue to vote for the Republican Party, despite the fact that the Republican Party doesn't fulfill any of its promises, doesn't follow through on actually rolling back government in any significant way. But they're pro-life, and they talk a
Mhm.
good game there, and that draws people in, and they can't imagine trying to leave something like abortion up to uh, market forces. So, what would be your answer to that, both on the abortion front and in general, on if people Christians who are trying to be led by the Bible and by God can truly embrace a kind of market anarchy view of civil governance?
Sure. Well, the primary difference between minarchism and anarchism is the market environment. It's the difference between a monopoly and non-monopoly. And so, just like we wouldn't want healthcare to be monopolized or education to be monopolized, or any of those other important things that we need to be monopolized. Christian anarchists also say that we don't want the state to be monopolized. So if we look at, say, Romans 13, where God says, through Paul, that we are to submit to the governing authorities, there's nothing in there that says that we have to have a monopoly state. So under what anarchists call a polycentric legal order, you simply have a non-monopoly civil governance. And so you have multiple agencies providing the service of adjudicating disputes and administering civil justice. You have competition for law enforcement. You have competition for magistrates and that sort of thing. And so, just like with market forces in, say, healthcare or education, when you have competition, when you introduce competition into the situation, you actually um, incentivize those businesses to provide a quality good or service at an affordable price. There's no reason to believe that we can't do that with civil governance as well. In fact, what we find with the monopoly state is, and this is, the difference between anarchists and minarchists, is that you may be able to limit the state temporarily, right? Like in America, we were able to have a fairly limited state for, roughly 100 years, and for the past 100 years, it's been growing out of control. So, and when you get there, when it starts to grow out of control, you get a lower quality service and it's more expensive. So, scripture doesn't prescribe for us a political philosophy, which is sort of the way that we conceptualize how to actually go about administering civil justice. Um, that's something for us to work out. And at least from an anarchist perspective, we would say, okay, we've tried this monopoly state thing like a million times throughout the course of human history, and it hasn't worked. There are examples of anarchic type societies, which I believe the longest standing anarchic society was Celtic Ireland. But the as far as abortion is concerned, and we can get into that a little bit more, um, this really boils down to where the solutions for abortion are going to come from. And I would say that the state has demonstrated that it is incapable of providing effective solutions that don't violate rights when it comes to many things like the drug war or this COVID nonsense, and I extend that all the way to abortion. And so I see that that market forces actually give us as pro-lifers an advantage in not only protecting the unborn, but also supporting women who are in those crisis pregnancy situations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it it's funny how, I mean, it's such a tired metaphor because I hear it all the time, but I just love it. I always go back to the metaphor of the state being like the ring of power in Lord of the Rings, and it's
Hmm.
like it's very tempting to want to use that ring for good, but you ultimately can't. It ultimately is always going to twist whatever good intentions you have. You can't see what consequences are going to come of the power that you are advocating for down the road. And not only that, but let's say, Donald Trump actually he won, let's say he won, and in his first year of his second term, he somehow passed legislation to ban abortion.
Hmm.
That's not a victory that stands for all time. All it takes is
Mm-mm.
4 years and another president, and that gets overturned. So even if you could somehow use that power to accomplish something good, it's a at best a temporary victory, because
Right.
all and really the culture war is escalating is a reflection of this. The more the state power has grown, each side tries to use it against the other one,
Hmm.
but the only people really benefiting from it are the people at top who keep getting richer and who
Right.
keep on, you know, getting away with more and more nefarious things behind the scenes. And
Right.
so yeah, there's like there's the fact that we can analyze the state mechanisms and how much they failed, as you were alluding to actually bring us about anything good. And then two, there's the cost that's associated with that. And
Hmm.
it doesn't really appear to me that um, the state is capable of banning, like you said, banning abortion in a way that wouldn't come at the expense of a greater attack on people's rights and essential liberties.
Yeah, well, and one of my favorite thinkers, Robert Higgs, who did some excellent work on, he wrote a book. Well, he's written several things, but he wrote a book called Crisis in Leviathan. And he actually went through and studied how the state will use crises in order to get power grabs and grow itself. And
It's
at
too
any,
bad we don't have any modern examples of
I know.
that.
Um, well, and he's the one that introduced me to the concept of democide as well, which
Hmm.
is where democide is where governments have killed people in non-war situations. Um, So that's a topic that isn't talked about a lot. But one of his sayings that I absolutely love, I think it sums things up nicely, is this. He says, without the state, we're going to have a bad situation. But with the state, we're going to have a much worse situation.
Hmm.
And, that really sort of I think it's sobering insofar as coming to realize, look, we live in a sinful, fallen world, right? We have conflict, we have disagreements, we have these things that put human beings at odds with one another, and we have a choice as to how we can go about dealing with that as a problem. And so, libertarians and anarchists don't propose any sort of utopian vision. We actually say, no, life is full of problems. And the best way to solve those problems are through market means, because using the state is much worse. And that's manifest. That's self-evidently true.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are many fallacies that come out of statism, but the nirvana fallacy is the
Mm,
biggest one because
yeah.
people will always go, well, what about this and this and this? Why, if we don't have the state, how are we going to solve all these problems? And the two problems with that are A, to assume that there's only one way you can solve problems, and that's with a monopoly of force,
Right.
and B, that the solutions that we have to come up with have to be perfect and have to solve every problem in the world. It's like if your goal in this life is to create a society that doesn't have some kind of drawback to it, you're not going to find it.
Yeah.
But what you can do is say, I would rather deal with problems that occur naturally than to create some sort of institution that's going to not only fail to correct those problems, but is going to incur a whole different set of problems as a consequence of its creation. And
Yeah.
you go ahead.
Well, this is what the market is for, because this is what economics is for. It's for solving problems. A lot of people who don't understand free market economics sort of look at the market as being, oh, it's the stock market. It's all these, suits in New York or Washington who are making bank off the working man. And it's like, no, that's not what it is. The economy is you and me exchanging ideas, right? Where we're making exchanges for mutually beneficial ends. We're improving our lives together, right? We're solving each other's problems by innovating and coming up with these ideas and producing and all of that. So the idea with the market is to provide solutions, and not just one solution, which is what the government provides. They try and provide a one size fits all solution. The market provides multiple solutions so that individuals can choose which solution works best for them. And that's how we solve these problems. And are they solved permanently? No, right? We're always going to have those problems, but we can solve problems in such a way that everybody benefits out of it in some fashion. I mean, even just last year, before COVID hit, there were reports coming out that abject poverty across the world had been raised. We had lifted the most poorest nations out of poverty just through through the market means that we have now, which aren't free market. Of course, they're mixed market, mixed between capitalism and socialism. But even, with how much capitalism we have had, that's allowed us to raise the entire world out of abject poverty. So that's a benefit to all.
No, it was the governments that lifted us out of poverty with, their the money printer Gobert, remember? That's what.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh God.
Well, and the reports now after COVID is that the world, especially third world countries who really depended on Western economies, have now plummeted. They're going back into abject poverty because of these lockdowns.
Yeah, but we can't talk about that because uh, everyone needs to stay home and save lives and wear masks and save lives. But But no one, I mean, you said, like you said, the market is for solving problems, and the market
Mhm.
is people. It's just we often speak in these like euphemisms, and like we say like the state and the market, and they're useful labels, but what we sometimes forget is that these are labels for people acting.
Mhm.
Like in uh this goes back to the idea of human action that the Austrian school and Mises talked about, and uh, everything is reducible to human action, and humans
Mhm.
are they're better off acting when they're acting in their own self-interest, not like doesn't mean selfishly like they're well, screw everyone around me, but no, they're making their own judgments based upon their own values of their situation, and going out into the marketplace, which is interacting with other people, and you know and that is how the market works, is people having goals and things that they want to achieve, and then finding the best means that the market has available to them, and
Mhm.
then and then vice versa, people who go out and see things that people need and figure out ways to provide that, and
Yeah.
that synergistic force of people needing things and people providing those needs is what the market is. It's just people acting,
Right.
and it's not like it's magic. It's so when people when libertarians, when we talk about how the free market can provide these things, a lot of people can't understand what we're saying is people can provide these things, but
Right.
what the state does as a monopoly is it prevents human innovation from working in its the way that it can when
Mhm.
you let it operate in the market. When it operates in the state, what do you get? I mean, I like that analogy. Having the state run something is like, compare it to, imagine if the DMV ran everything. And everyone hates going to the DMV and waiting in line and knows how inefficient it is. And it's like, do you really want the DMV to run healthcare? Do you want the DMV to run education and run all these things? But as much as people can complain about, it's funny. I feel like a lot of people complain about the state in their daily lives, but
Yeah.
then when you actually challenge them to imagine, well, what if we didn't use it? They go, well,
Like that's
that's
not a category. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and the
doesn't compute.
latest example is this whole thing with the COVID vaccine. Because, it's supposed to be Operation Warp Speed, right? And we're supposed to get the vaccine out with warp speed. And the big complaint right now is it's not getting out fast enough. So, like, there's these people, the idea that a select group of people who work for the government can actually solve all the problems while we sit back and wait for them to solve these problems is absurd. That doesn't it's not demonstrable. Like, what we actually find in reality is government makes these promises, and not only are they uh unable to follow through with their promises, they end up causing harm in the process. And there's simply no example of them actually following through with their promises in an effective, affordable way that is the most advantageous that it could be. Like, that doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't. And what's funny is, like, I'm willing to give the devil his due sometimes. And when a lot of Republican conservative Christians talk about Trump, and you're like, he's the best president we've ever had, and I'll go, you know what? On balance, he might be the best president that I've witnessed in my lifetime. uh, it's not saying much. Like, I mean, he did cut taxes, but he did not cut spending. Spending increased. I
Mhm.
guess he didn't start any major new wars, but he kept the old ones going and increased drone strikes that compared to his predecessor, Obama.
Mhm.
And he didn't deliver on healthcare. We still have Obamacare, and we built some more border wall, but it's not done. So I mean, the economy was supposedly booming, but I mean, it's easy to boom a bubble economy that's funded by uh, Fed printed money. Like
Yeah.
all Trump did was play the same. cards that his predecessors did. So it's like, okay, maybe he wasn't as disastrous as some presidents before him. I don't really see that as something to celebrate. I mean, to me,
Y-
that's just like looking at, if I was a slave and went, oh, well, this slave master beat me less than my last two slave masters. It's like, well,
Right.
that's
You're s-
good, but it's
you're
not
still a slave.
right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd say Trump in some ways probably slowed the inevitable demise of the United States government. But yeah, well, I I don't really play that game with my friends. It's like, if you want to nitpick, I could certainly pull out good things that Barack Obama did, and I'm no fan of his. So, a
There's always
broken
always
clock is right
right.
twice a day.
Well, and they have to, they have to do a little bit. They have to keep up the illusion, so by doing the bare minimum to say, oh, we did something. They throw us some scraps and say, look, we're taking care of you, we care about you, but it's all
Yeah.
just a it's all just a house of cards.
Yep.
So we touched a bit on it, but how would the market deal with abortion, do you think? And I know this is something you talked a little bit about in your debate with Walter.
Mhm.
Walter pushed the idea of what they called evictionism, I believe is what he called it, which I had to admit I'd never heard of before that debate, and I had to say that was at least like, well, that's a lot better than the stuff that Democrats put out, which is like, abortion on demand up to 40 weeks. Evictionism is certainly an improvement on that. Um, but what are ways that the market would solve for abortion? Do you think that there would be any like market restrictions on it, or would we just be, would the focus be more on like people who are pro-life trying to encourage mothers to not make that choice?
Well, yeah, no, this is a great question. And I love getting this question. And every time I answer it, I try and improve it a little bit because I've got this idea in my head and I want to be able to convey it to people. When we talk about the abortion problem, typically what we think about is mom's got a crisis pregnancy that she doesn't want. What do we do with that? And the way I look at this problem is we have to go much further back to how did she get into this crisis pregnancy to begin with? And one thing that conservative pro lifers do not like to do is they do not like to look at the data, the statistics about why women seek abortions to begin with. And I'm of the opinion that if we actually take that data seriously, that gives us a glimpse into how the market might actually solve those problems. So the two number one reasons or the two top reasons why women seek abortion to begin with are poverty and bad relationships. Now, we've already discussed how a free market actually lifts the entire world out of poverty, right? Now, I'm a single mom and I work from home and I also homeschool, but I would not be able to make that happen without goods and services from the market, from the economy. For example, all three of my kids, and I'm not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. I'm technically poor, but all three of my kids own computers. They own very basic computers, which get them online so that we can homeschool online. And most of our education or educational resources we find for free. So, um, that's a need that the market provides for me that allows me to take care of my kids. So, what we actually find with these statistics is that during Democrat administrations, what usually happens is the abortion rate starts to decline. And then under Republican administrations, that decline slows down. Now, over time, since about the mid 80s, and up until today, the rate of abortions that are occurring today are actually lower than Roe v. Wade, than pre Roe v. Wade numbers. So we are below the number of abortions that were occurring at the time Roe v. Wade was decided. So that number has been decreasing, but It mostly decreases under Democratic administrations. Now, Democrats use this data point to say, see, this is why we need entitlements. This is why we need welfare, food stamps, um, all these things for women, because this is going to, and I say Democrats, I mean like pro-life Democrats or pro-life liberal Christians, will say, this is what we should do. We should increase entitlement spending. And I say, no, if we actually look at what's going on, you have a woman who is having her most basic needs met in the form of food stamps or welfare, or maybe she gets childcare so that she can go have a job, right? These are all economic things. And so if welfare, right, which isn't the best option, if welfare can actually slow the rate of decline for women with crisis pregnancies, then certainly a free market can have a much better effect. So how might that look? Well, I mentioned before that we find educational resources basically for free. When you have a free market, you have so many options available that things that might have been considered luxuries before are staples and easily accessible, or relatively easily accessible to people who are in lower income brackets. So, if the free market lifts the world out of poverty, if the free market provides for the most basic needs of people in these situations, for moms in these situations, then there's no reason to believe that a free market wouldn't mitigate the felt need for abortion. When it comes to bad relationships, what's necessary in order to prevent those is education. Again, something like I can very easily go get an education about relationships on the internet for virtually nothing. So all of this can be provided for by the market and can improve people's lives. And women, it is shown with the data that women who have those most basic needs met, who feel like they can actually support that child, they're more likely to keep the baby. That's just been demonstrated over and over and over. So in my mind, there's no need to try and control women's choices and things like that. The idea here is that when a woman is faced with a crisis pregnancy, right, and she is standing in her bathroom with that little abortion pill in her hand and staring herself down in the mirror, she's the only one who has the power to throw that pill down the toilet and not take it. And so what we have to do is provide the environment necessary to help her feel like she's got that support. And I think the free market can do that way better than entitlement spending, way better than regulation of the abortion industry. I mean, conservatives like to talk a huge game about being advocates of capitalism, but when it comes to abortion, they're very, very socialist. And they are interested in regulating the abortion industry, as they've demonstrated.
Absolutely. Yeah, and welfare is kind of a key thing here, and on both those issues, because as far as the ability of needs being met correlating to less abortions, attempted or done, well, we know that money given to government for welfare is like at least 50% just goes to paying government bureaucrats,
Mhm.
and I think really less than 50% of the money that goes to government that you could say is allocated for welfare actually gets directly sent out to people.
Mhm.
So the free market is shown, private charities, more money goes to even like the worst charity that doesn't give as much of its money, because you can go online and find rankings of charities and how much money uh, that they take in goes towards paying people. Even the worst charities, though, give out more than government does as far as a percentage of what they take in. So yeah, if welfare is at all helpful, it is just a blunt, weak, pathetic attempt compared to what the free market could do. And then two, you usually with private charity and stuff, there's more like you have to go seek it out, and um, it's not just a free handout all the time. A lot of times it's like you have to be like it might be coming through church, or you getting involved in some kind of program that helps that helps you out. Whereas government is just kind of like, hey, here's the check, and there you go. So it doesn't help with teaching women or incentivizing them to make better choices in their relationships. It actually
Hmm.
probably has the opposite effect. And uh, not to say that I'm not trying to sound judgmental towards women, like or anything like that, but it's just you know socialism, like you said, it's just it doesn't produce as good of an outcome as the free market is capable of doing.
Right.
So
Well, and even in, those bad relationships that I talked about is one of the reasons why women seek abortion. Those are abusive relationships. And one of the things that I have learned since doing my research, and especially since I've had my, did my debate with Walter, um, I'm I've come to a realization that our culture doesn't actually understand abuse very well, and we don't understand how abuse works in terms of rights and responsibilities, and how to avoid an abusive relationship, but also how to get out of an abusive relationship. There are all those things, um, and my argument with the abortion debate is that if we absolutize fetal rights, right? If we say that the fetus from the moment conception is complete is a self owner with basic human rights, um, if we do that, if we absolutize fetal rights, we actually absolutize women's rights. And we know exactly what is what she is in relation to her fetus, not just a mother, but she's got a proprietary claim there. And we more often than not, especially the pro-life view, tends to treat women as though they're just incubators. Like, let's just get that baby out and kind of leave her hanging after the fact. Like that's the goal. And I know pro-lifers hate hearing that, but and there are individual pro-lifers who work against that, but by and large the political arm of the pro-life movement is exactly that. They're interested in getting those babies born, and then they sort of say, okay, you're there's no point in helping you after that. You have to bootstrap everything.
and it's
Now
such
I
a it's such a waste. Like the amount of money and energy that goes into the political part of the pro-life movement. I just well,
Yeah.
think of the hours and the money that you're putting into that. What if you put that into building more women's shelters and more church organizations that go out there
Mhm.
and try to provide aid, mutual aid and stuff to
Right.
mothers in difficult situations. To me,
Yeah.
that would have a much you could have abortion 100% legal in the statist sense, but you could see abortion decline rapidly
Yeah.
if Christians focused on, you know, actually going out there and trying to, combat it head on in the market versus trying to, you know, continue in this futile attempt to just get, a piece of paper that says it's banned, but okay,
Right.
well then what? Just
Yeah. Then
it
you have the black market.
right.
Look, and I write about this in the book, right? I talk about what would society look like if abortion were legal, but we had a libertarian society, we had a completely unregulated market. Look, as it exists now, CPCs, crisis pregnancy centers, outnumber Planned Parenthood centers as it exists now. And Planned Parenthood is having a hard time staying in business. In New Mexico, they passed with this COVID relief bill that they passed here in the state. They included a bailout of Planned Parenthood. Okay, so under the economy as it exists now, the abortion industry is failing. In a free market where we are allowed to compete, where Planned Parenthood is subject to market forces, subject to compete, we have an opportunity to actually provide a better options to mothers with crisis pregnancies, for less money, that is more safe, right? Suddenly, the abortion option becomes the dangerous, expensive, and uh, immoral option. And so people would inevitably not choose it. They would go out of business. We could put them out of business. And as it stands right now, CPCs provide more services than Planned Parenthood. Um, like, for example, there are some CPCs that actually offer pro bono legal services to women who are in abusive relationships so that they can get out, right? Um, Whereas Planned Parenthood, they're actually facilitating human trafficking and the sex trade by covering up teens who go in for abortions with their pimps or with their handlers, because they got pregnant in the sex trade. So it if we understand economics and we understand the power of the market and we understand the power of consumer regulation, there's no reason to believe that if we had a completely unregulated market, even without a law prohibiting abortion, we could put the abortion industry out of business.
Yeah, I think that's the best argument I've heard. Even more, I mean, you made a lot of these same arguments with Walter, but I can tell you've refined them a bit more since then,
Yeah.
on how the market is the best means for combating abortion,
Hmm.
and even in the worst case scenario of a free market that where even if you lived in a society where people did not view abortion as murder, that just the incentives of abortion, as far as like the financial aspects of it already in our society today, where abortion is not just legal but subsidized, it's
Hmm.
already failing. So
Right. Yeah.
you remove the government subsidies and bailouts, which that's I'll have to find the maybe you can share that with me. The You said Colorado, was Colorado a
New
bill, or New
Mexico.
Mexico, where
Yeah.
you said they bailed out Planned Parenthood? That's
Yep. Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. And oh man, I just lost my thought. I hate it when that happens. Well, if it comes back to me, I'll bring it back up.
Sure. Um, and yeah, I love Walter. I know you love him too. That was
Yeah.
he's a really great thinker, really nice guy. What was that experience like? As far as like, how did you even um, you know were you just like the only libertarian who was like, I have a good pro-life argument? Because I know like libertarians hate talking about abortion. Like
Yeah.
I'm like, out of all the libertarian groups I'm a part of on Facebook, I think like half of them have like a rule like, we will not talk about abortion, because
Yeah.
that just like goes downhill so quick.
Yeah.
And I was glad to see you and Walter had like actually a really good like conversation about it. And
Yeah.
like he it wasn't nasty or anything like you sometimes see on Facebook. And so what was that experience like, as far as the debate? And like, was there anything that like Walter said that like made you had to go back and rethink things, or any arguments he presented that you weren't like prepared for, or anything? Or how was that?
Yeah, I felt a little bad because I mean, first of all, that was my very first debate. Definitely my very first public debate. I also I had a fear of public speaking. I think I'm pretty well over it now. But I had a fear of public speaking. And so I spent at least 6 months. I want to say about 10 months notice for the debate. So um, Gene Epstein, who hosts the Soho Forum, had called me early in the year 2019 to invite me to debate. And basically, the way he found me was through Pete's podcast. I feel really bad because I'm terrible at pronouncing his last name, but he has the Free Man Beyond the Wall
Yes,
podcast.
I can't pronounce his
Um,
last name either. Otherwise, I
and
would try.
and I should
Quijones, I
because
think. Pete Quijones, I think.
yes, yeah, and
Yeah,
I I feel terrible because I'm in New Mexico and I'm around Spanish all the time. I should be able to say that, but anyways,
I'm in PA. I have an excuse.
um, at any rate, and Pete's wonderful. So Pete had actually heard my fetal self ownership arguments from my podcast. And so he invited me on Free Man Beyond the Wall, and we talked about it. And Gene Epstein had heard me on Pete's podcast. And when he called me up, he said, well, we've been wanting to do this abortion debate, but we wanted, number one, we didn't want the old tired debate because everybody's tired of that. And I think that's part of the reason why, excuse me, why libertarians don't like talking about it is because it's the old debate is old and we've hashed through it and it doesn't work. And so at any rate, Gene liked my argument. I don't know that he agreed. Well, I know that he said that he definitely agreed with Walter, but he appreciated that I was bringing a fresh perspective to it. And he wanted a woman taking the pro-life position, especially since, Walter being a man is taking the pro-choice position. So that was sort of how I fell into it. As far as the experience was wonderful. The Soho Forum people are absolutely wonderful people. It was a very welcoming experience. And, during the debate, it was probably the most calm and amicable debate you could possibly imagine, especially for the abortion debate. And, I think people were really engaged and they were listening and they asked great questions. So at any rate, as far as, being prepared for Walter's arguments, I was very well prepared and I felt bad because I wasn't able to actually put anything formal out there so that he could really prepare for my argument. So at any rate, but I don't think that anything that I presented was anything that caught him off guard. I wasn't really caught off guard with anything he said. I just sort of, in hindsight was like, oh, I should have said this. So at any rate, the debate went really well and the reception that I've had from it has been wonderful. Lots of positive feedback, even from pro-choicers who have said that they appreciate me taking women's rights into consideration. Like they may even disagree with me, but we can have a conversation, right? Which is something that is very difficult to do between a pro-lifer and a pro-choicer. But we can have these conversations. Most of the people that I've received positive feedback from are those people who have sort of been in the middle, in the gray area. So, you're very militant pro-lifers. They don't like me very much because I'm not morally outraged and demanding for an overturn of Roe v. Wade. And the militant pro-choicers don't like me because, I'm just, a conservative Christian incognito. But there's this huge gray area in between. And, those people who will say, well, I'm pro-life, or I'm pro-choice, and those are the people that have really given me a lot of positive feedback about it.
And that's really the majority of people. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
at least that's my opinion. I could be wrong, but in my experience, there's loud people, but they're a minority on both sides. But most
Mm-hmm.
people, even if they disagree, with us on this particular issue, they recognize that it's they're in that gray area where they're like they can see the other side, even if they don't come down quite the same as we do. And
Yep.
and yeah, I mean, yeah, that debate was really good. I mean, if that was your first debate, you did very well. I mean, you handled it well. And I was when I first went, I had watched Walter before on Sam Cedar's show, which is the Majority Report. And
Okay.
those debates did not go well because Walter got
Mm.
very irate with
Oh
Sam. Now
no.
Sam's a bit of a troll, but still,
Mm-hmm.
Walter. That was my only time I'd watched Walter in a debate, so I went in like, oh God, like what's gonna happen? But it went really well, um and yeah, it's a good debate that I can like show people when I'm dealing with other anarchists and libertarians who will like, are you pro-life? And I'm like, yes, but I'm not trying to use the state. And then like I can link that debate and be like, here's a good, rundown on kind of,
Mm-hmm.
the way I come. And that was, you helped put to words kind of what my intuitions were.
Mm-hmm.
But I had avoided the abortion topic for a while because I didn't really know how to articulate it because like
Yeah.
I knew that the market could probably handle these things, but I didn't know, I didn't really know how to put it. And it's just tough because, I grew up a Republican and well, I grew up a Republican and then I was kind of a Democrat for a little bit. But even when I
Mm-hmm.
was a Democrat, I was still pro life and
Yeah.
very strongly so. So I didn't get along with, even though I voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016, which was the last time I voted,
Uh-huh.
um, uh, people still didn't like me on the left because I was pro
Sure.
life and a Christian.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah.
those two strikes together, you're taboo. But
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
so I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about then was your other. We talked about LCI in the book. We talked about the debate with Walter. Your project or your page is called Mere Liberty. Let's talk about that. First of all, what is there anything behind the name? Like, where'd you come up with the name, and like, what's it, tied into like what the your page and your work is about?
Yeah, so Mere Liberty is a spinoff of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which
Okay.
is, Mere Christianity is sort of Christianity. It's at its most basic core. So Mere Liberty, when I started it, was based off of that. It was the idea of, talking about liberty at its most basic core. And I started that blog back in 2012 with sort of the idea in mind of, you know, as I said at the beginning, I challenge paradigms. So the paradigm that I initially had in mind was the political spectrum, the paradigm of the political spectrum, left versus right, and so it's just challenging this idea that there's only two sides to any given issue, um, and so I really wanted to use the blog to challenge ideas in such a way that, hey, maybe there's a third or fourth or fifth way of looking at these things. Maybe there are good things to talk about from either the left or the right that we need to consider. So that's how it started. Eventually it grew and matured, and I really started incorporating Reformed theology into it and reformational philosophy as far as I could. I'm still learning that. And then of course, libertarian philosophy. And so I talk about these ideas of these political ideas, cultural ideas, economic ideas. I try to do it from a reformational perspective. I try to do it from a libertarian perspective. And especially since my debate with Walter, I really want to incorporate a view of these things from the perspective of women and how the state has impacted women, how the economy impacts women. I hate to call it women's studies, but there is a little bit of element to that. Um, it's not feminist. I'm not feminist. In fact, I have a couple of articles up there explaining why I'm not a feminist, because it's a lot of people will confuse me with feminism, but at any rate, so I talk about a lot of things that may not seem connected at first. Like my two major topics that I talk about are libertarianism and this idea of fetal self ownership and abortion, and then I also talk about human identity, particularly for women from a Christian perspective. So, in fact, in 2021, I tend to start sort of bringing those paths together and showing how they do touch, how they do intersect.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't catch that Mere Liberty, Mere Christianity. I love that book, but it just didn't hit me until you described it that that was what you were going for.
Yeah.
Um, the uh, the reformed part, and have you always been like reformed, or that's something that you came to later in life, or what was your background as a Christian as far as that goes?
Sure. Yeah. No, I grew up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is a conservative branch of the Lutheran Church. Um, and over the course of my life, eventually became Reformed. Lutherans are very insistent that you do not include them under the Reformed umbrella.
They don't even like to be called Protestant sometimes.
Yeah, no, they really don't like the word Protestant. At any rate, yeah. So they don't like being called Reformed or Protestant. So eventually, over the course of time, I found Reformed theology, and I think I appreciated it because I think Reformed theology sort of gets into more details about things that I had questions about in the Lutheran Church, and I love the LCMS. In fact, right now I'm attending an LCMS church, uh, um, although I'm not a communicant member there. I'm their resident Calvinist. Uh, um,
It's funny.
but yeah, at any rate, I just came over the course of time came to several conclusions, one of which is I'm definitely Calvinist. I definitely hold to the Westminster Confession. Um, I do think that Lutheran theology paved a way for me that I'm blessed to have. We have lots of things in common. Calvinists and Lutherans, I think, have a lot more in common than both sides tend to give each other credit for.
I would
Although
agree to
there,
that. Yeah.
yeah, although there are significant differences, which is why I tell my pastor all the time, I'm sorry, I'm really not Lutheran. But, um, at any rate, yeah, that's essentially my background.
Yeah, I came to Calvinism later in life, very recently actually. I think it's only been a year and a half now. I
Mm,
think I think August or September of 2019 actually is when I uh, became a Calvinist. Actually, I was very anti-Calvinist and started debating with Calvinists on Facebook, and then realized I had a bad understanding of it,
mhm,
which is funny. A lot of the Christian libertarian, at least the Christian anarchist community, and probably maybe even Christianity overall in the West, a lot of them, if they're not reformed, they have a very very negative view of Calvinism and
mhm,
reformed theology, which is interesting and unfortunate, and especially like the main criticism, which I'm curious for your thoughts on, is like a lot of Christian libertarians don't understand like how Calvinists can be libertarians or anarchists. They're like, to them it seems like those things are in conflict, which obviously we don't find them to be in conflict at all.
right.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, as far as maybe why that negative perception exists? Is it just because like there are some loud, cage stagey, hyper Calvinists on the internet that you know are annoying to some people, or is it people misunderstanding Reformed theology, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that there are a few reasons. I think as far as the objection that Calvinists can't be libertarian, I think that probably comes from the strain of Calvinists who were establishmentarians, who wanted a theocratic government of some sort. And those people still exist. So it's not like it's not like, you know, our view, those of us who are reformed anarchist or reformed libertarian, it's not like our view is like settled among Galvanists, because it's not. But as far as sort of the more negative sense of Calvinism. I think that comes from a few things. One, a misunderstanding. You've got that term hyper Calvinist out there, which if you examine hyper Calvinism next to legitimate Calvinism, it's hyper Calvinism is not Calvinism in the slightest. Um,
It's like capitalism and crony capitalism.
exactly. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's a great analogy. But you also have, I think that in Reformed theology, you have several more strains of, or roots that Calvinists took. You've got the Zwinglians, you have Calvin himself, you have the Dutch Reformed view, you have the Scottish Presbyterians. You've got these different strains who all have their different idiosyncrasies. Some of them can be a little bit more staunch or harsh than others. But maybe, some of the other objections to Calvinism is that we're Christians who still believe in things like total depravity, right? That all human beings are inherently sinful rather than inherently good. And that's something that society doesn't really like to think about. They want to think about people as being generally good. Calvinists believe that people are inherently sinful. Incidentally, that's that's a very good motivation for reformed anarchists, because we would say, yes, everybody is sinful. So why would you concentrate power in the hands of
Right.
sinners in the form of monopoly government?
That's what I think it's what C.S. Lewis said, even though he wasn't reformed, but he was like, like men is flawed and evil, and no man is. I'm trying to remember the exact word. Like, no man is fit to rule over even himself, let alone, other people. Least of all the one, and least of all the one who seeks it.
Yeah.
I think it's what C.S. Lewis said, which is, yeah. I mean, that was going to say, like, to me, some people are like, well, if you think people are evil, don't you need a state? Like, no, like it's the opposite. People are sinful and flawed, and historically speaking, it seems like statism makes that worse. Like when people gain that
Right.
political power. I mean, sure, sinful people can cause harm, but when you can only cause harm with the power that you yourself wield versus political power. Political
Yeah.
power, it's like a modifier. It scales the
Hmm.
amount of evil that can be done.
Yeah.
So
Well, and we would certainly say, as reformed anarchists, we would say that people are capable of governing themselves, insofar as we have common grace, right? Um,
yeah,
and some people govern themselves better than others, but the point is that nobody is fit to govern or rule another person, at least at least in the sense of somebody assuming that authority over you. Now, can you choose leaders for yourself? Yes. Is there a legitimate authority in the world? Yes. But that is arguably not found in the state. Um, so
yeah. I mean, if it's a legitimate authority and people are, uh, to me, it's like a legitimate authority is an authority that people don't need coercion to submit to.
right.
In my opinion, it's like, I mean,
Yeah.
aside for now people who are doing evil, maybe that's the exception. They, obviously we would say that force can be used in defense against people who are initiating aggression, but outside of that, like the authority that like my pastor has in my life is authority that he doesn't need coercion to exercise. I voluntarily
Right.
submit to his authority.
Right.
And that's also the same kind of submission to authority that you see in marriage, that you see in the workplace. An employee to his employer.
Hmm.
So that kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah.
what would you say is the connection as far as like reformed theology to then like philosophy? Because I know you said like you're trying to bring reformed theology into these philosophical aims that you're getting at, as far as in your work with Mere Liberty. So what's the connection that you're making there?
Well, um, Gregory Baus is definitely way better at answering this question than I am, because he's the one who introduced me to it. But no, there's an actual field of philosophical study called Reformational philosophy. It was started by a Calvinist in the Netherlands by the name of Herman Dooyeweert, um, and he was a follower of Abraham Kuyper, who's a very famous Dutch Reformed Calvinist, um, who had a concept of sphere sovereignty, uh, um, and and Dooyeweert has a philosophy that is non-reductionist, which basically means, life is complex and it's dynamic, and we can't actually reduce it to anything, in it. Like we can't reduce, for example, we can't reduce the problem of a pandemic down to masks and social distancing and vaccines. Like that's ridiculous. So the non-reductionist sort of take on the world is that it's complex, um, and you can't reduce it. It's all worth studying. It and specifically that our religious belief informs our study of the world. So no matter which religious belief you hold, even atheism, that's going to inform how you see these other aspects of reality. Um, so, one of the things that is applicable in my situation with my research, what I'm doing, especially when it comes to, say, the abortion debate, is to say we can't reduce the problem of abortion to, slutty, irresponsible women, right? We can't reduce the problem of abortion down to even just bad choices, right? Because there's economics that are involved in that. We can't reduce the problem of abortion down to, well, we need a law, right? There's a number of things that are involved. It's complex, it's dynamic, and if we take it seriously as such, then maybe we can actually start providing solutions to the problem, rather than continuing to throw darts at these things.
Yeah, in other words, like there's not a one size fits all solution that will apply across the board, and
Right.
you know, statism is like using a hammer and going around and assuming everything's a nail.
Yeah. Well, and I think intuitively we know this, all those
Hmm.
people that we talked about being in the gray area who will say, I'm pro life, but, or I'm pro choice, but is always followed with, it's complicated, right?
Right.
Most everybody probably knows somebody who has had an abortion or at least has had an unwanted pregnancy and has had to work through the problems that are associated with that. Those are varied, they're dynamic, they're based on individual circumstances, and those individual circumstances are all different. And we might find patterns, right, that arise, which is how we try to find solutions. But you're not going to see those patterns until you actually understand that it is a complex and dynamic, complicated problem, because we are complex and dynamic human beings with complex and dynamic circumstances. So at any rate, um, that's basically the area that I'm using reformational philosophy in.
Cool. That's awesome. Um, yeah, the reformed worldview is just it is very deep, and there's so much more to it than just Calvin. I mean, it's funny that we call it Calvinism when really it's like I guess he's kind of maybe the historical, uh trying to think of the
Figure
right word. Yeah,
figurehead.
the figurehead
Hmm.
that kind of like started the movement. But I mean, since then there's been a lot of reformers that have done a lot of work since him. So it's funny that he gets, we focus so much on him. I mean, I've found a lot of, and it's so deep. There's so much in the reformed worldview, and the different schools of it, and confessions and writings and stuff to study.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, the sphere sovereignty uh, is definitely a really interesting concept that I've started to read more about. that I think really helps to give a good answer to uh, the passages that are hard for Christians to handle, like Romans 13, and like trying to
Hmm.
figure out, what's the proper role of authority. And it just seems to me that, and I'm not trying to be divisive when I say this, but it just seems to me that the reformed anarchist position is the most biblically consistent Christian libertarian message, because it actually contends with these passages and doesn't just like either come up with lukewarm answers of like, oh yeah, well, it does support a state, but we don't have to, and just kind of, or to say, to go as far as uh some people that just go, well, I don't like Paul, so
Yeah.
which is I think that's the most common answer I hear people on Christian libertarian and anarchist pages. They'll say, what about Romans 13? It's like, well, it's Paul, so I don't like Paul. So it's like, well, that's just such a, you're just
Yeah.
avoiding it. It's like,
That,
whereas,
yeah.
what we do is we actually, well, no, what are these passages talking about? And let's dive into them deep and understand the worldview that's being built here. And
Yeah.
and then it's a very good systematic theology that that I think and uh, yeah, that categorizes these things well and into ways that can be easily understood and expressed. Yeah,
Hmm.
after talking with Greg, it was like it was very helpful. Like I finally had an answer to Romans 13 that I felt
Hmm.
content with. That like, because
Yeah.
before it was like people like, what about Romans 13? And I'd be like, well, I don't know. Like here's 10 different answers, and
Yeah.
pick the
Pick
one
one.
that you like the most. And I still do that. Like if someone's not reformed, and or if someone's just like asking me if they're not a Christian, I'll go, well, here's a few different areas. Here's the
Yeah.
one that I mean, because I prefer people to reject the state. So if they're not going to accept my answer, then it's like, okay, well, how about this one? I'll give them an alternative one that might speak to them where they're at
Yeah.
more than mine. But I think that the idea that Romans 13 is speaking to civil governance and not the state, which to me is just easily uh, self-evident by the fact that it even says the rulers are not a terror to good works, but to bad works. It's like, well,
Right.
that's just such an easy foil to the state, because it's like, or any,
Yeah.
it's just easy. You can tell legitimate authority for what it is because of its fruit.
Right.
And Romans 13 is not uh, descriptive; it is prescriptive. It is
Hmm.
prescribing the role of civil governance, and you will know legitimate authority by the fact that they're acting within that scope, not just because
Right.
they claim that they are the proper authority.
Yeah, I think there's at least enough libertarian and anarchist interpretations of Romans 13 that it's time for those statist Christians to finally say, okay, we have to have a conversation about this. We can no longer say this is just about, the state, universally throughout history, no matter who it is, or what country it's in, or what time it's in, or whatever. I think that view runs into a huge problem, especially when it comes to that verse about governance being not being a terror to good. It's like, okay, if that's true and this applies to like the United States government, then what you're doing is you're baptizing all of these horrendous actions that the state takes and saying those are for your good, right? So the drone bombings, killing innocent civilians in the Middle East, that turns out to be um, for their good, right? That's a hard thing to defend, right? Abortion is another example, right? If our standard is whatever the government does, it does for our good, then we have to say abortion is for good, is for our good, and that's a contradiction. So it's completely untenable for us to say that that Romans 13 is descriptive. It has to be, this is how God intends civil governance to be. It's an idea. It's an ideal that we have to conform to, rather than this is just the way it is all the time.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, we have to believe that Paul was calling the Roman state that eventually killed like most of the apostles good.
Yeah.
Just is just not a comprehensible interpretation at all.
Well, and we run into some other problems if we also understand these terms and these things in terms of legitimate versus illegitimate authority. Because in marriage, for example, there is some legitimate authority that the husband has over the wife. We can't escape that in Scripture, but that doesn't give him license to abuse her.
Right.
Right. And so I know of one pastor in particular who's very a staunch advocate of abuse victims and supports divorce for in the cases of abuse. He's not very popular in Reformed circles, or he's growing in popularity, but then on the other hand turns around and says, no, we submit to the state. We absolutely submit to the state. This is, they're here for our good. And it's like, this is inconsistent. You can't hold this view of marriage and say that there's legitimate and illegitimate authority in marriage, and then not look at the state with those same eyes and say that all authority from the state is legitimate.
That's a good way of putting it. And it's almost like the state is an abusive relationship when you think about it, that we're forced into. I mean, it's like an arranged marriage almost, that you were like, before you were born, it was like you will be wed to the state. And no matter what, stuck in it. And I grew up seeing various women in my family who were caused great harm because they were essentially forced by pastors to stay in their abusive marriages. And I've always had very strong feelings against that. I mean, I mean, there's a line, I mean, if a woman is in a position in a marriage where her husband isn't treating her right, and she feels that she can stay there and love him and try to be used by Christ to kind of bring repentance and healing, like that might be something that can be sought after. But at the same time, like, it's just dicey. I don't think that we should be telling women to just to stay in relationships where they're getting continually, and to normalize that in our, it's a very harmful thing in church culture. And I know that's not popular to say in conservative Reformed circles, but it is something that I do view as harmful in the church culture. The very like negative talk we have, and rhetoric we have towards divorce. It's not that I think divorce is good, but I think the proper way to deal with divorce is, you said this towards the beginning of our conversation, which is like, prevention is better than cure. We should be seeking to, it's better to prevent people from getting into marriages that they shouldn't be into than to solve that problem once you're there. But you have to acknowledge that sometimes mistakes were made and there needs to be a solution. Even if it's not an ideal solution, there's not always going to be an ideal solution, like we talked about.
Yeah. Well, maybe you should have me back on to talk about complementarianism and marriage and divorce and all that, because I could say a million things about that.
Yeah, we'll do that. Well, it's been fun. I think we covered everything. So you do work for LCI. You have Mere Liberty. What other ways people can find you and follow what you're doing?
Well, of course, you can follow me on Facebook. I also started online classes teaching critical thinking using the Socratic method. So you can find information on those. It's for middle schoolers, high schoolers, and adults. You can find information on those seminars at courses.mereliberty.com.
What's the you're still doing? People can still sign up for the courses, or how long is that going?
So
next semester.
Registration for the spring semester, which starts January 4th, is closed.
Okay, it's closed. Okay.
Yeah, I closed it yesterday. If somebody wants to squeeze in, they would have to contact me very quickly, but I don't know when you're putting this out. Anyways, that class starts on January 4th. I will have summer classes just like I did last summer. But basically, it's a weekly seminar. You get a weekly lesson, and then we have a weekly Zoom call where I use a Socratic seminar style to basically teach the skills of critical thinking. So as I said, I do that for middle schoolers, high schoolers, and adults. I've had tons of really wonderful feedback. Everybody's loved it so far. You can see those testimonials on my courses site. So
cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Carrie. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And yeah, we'll definitely do it again sometime, maybe on the subject of marriage and relationships, because that is something I would like to talk about. But until then,
Sure.
I hope have a good rest of your night, and
Thank you.
yeah, be safe, and stay inside. Don't go out. It's dangerous.
Right. Yeah. So dangerous. Very good. Thank you.
Yep. Have a good night.